Their policy and politics are in the same place. So we have a level of abstraction, we have a level of granular, right? And the point is the way that these two commingle, I think, becomes problematic where these two things meet, because your identification of the primary problem, right? I mean, this is the point. Like you don't address moneyed interest per se in the book. The primary problem is, I mean, if you just do a summary of the book, primary problem has to do more with the regulation and the handcuffing the state has done of itself. But the state doesn't do it itself. Like all of this handcuffing comes from a place, and it's either moneyed interests or it's not. And so I have no doubt that at different times.
This is where I think you've really oversimplified politics.
You know, one of the most amazing things about today's online left is that Sam Seder of the Majority Report is held up as their intellectual champion, their person to send in to any given situation to debate anyone, whether they be on the right or whether they be slightly to the right of Sam Seder, but still on the incredibly far left, because Sam knows what's going on. He knows how to debate. He knows the issues, and he can handle any situation. And in reality, nothing could be further from the truth. I genuinely believe that people assume that Sam Seder is this intellectual champion of the left because he looks like a nerd, because he's wearing the wrinkly button-down shirts, because he has glasses, and because he talks in an incredibly boring way, when in reality, Sam Seder is no smarter than somebody like Cenk's nephew. He's no smarter than your average random lefty person. He's just been on the air for longer, and again, he has the aesthetic of a nerd, therefore people assume intelligence. And a perfect example of this is Sam Seder interviewing Ezra Klein. Ezra Klein is the author of the book Abundance. Now, I actually downloaded this book on audiobook, and I've listened to it all the way through, which is something that Sam Seder claims that he did as well.
Have you read the book?
I have. Well, I've listened to the book. Let's put it that way.
That's as good.
And to me, I like your read better than Derek's. Okay, but I've listened to both.
I listened to. All right, that just gives me a sense of at what level we're talking.
That's a different critique, but yes, I have read the book, and I've also read there's a tremendous amount of reviews about the book.
However, it is painfully obvious that Sam Seder may have listened to a chapter or two and then started reading critiques of the book, because he's completely unaware of the subject matter that he's talking about, and he inadvertently and repeatedly throughout the course of this interview ends up proving the truth of Ezra Klein's premise, which is these progressive policies end up stopping any kind of development, and of course, he provides no alternative solutions. Now, we're going to break this down in great detail, but before we do, I want to thank everybody who supports this channel via actualjusticewarrior.com/join.
Give me the money. Give me the money, okay?
Thematically, what is the book about?
The book is about a very simple question, which is, what do we need more of and how do we get it? And then the parts of the book that I think have aroused more controversy, critique, energy, conversation, is that much of the book is exploring the question of why in the places Democrats govern, or in the times when Democrats govern, are liberals, are Democrats, are in some cases people on the left, unable to produce more of the things we need. Why is there so little housing in California and New York? Sam, where are you? Just so I have you
in New York.
You're in New York. So why in places like New York and California and Illinois, where you have a lot of Democratic control, have they become very unaffordable? Why is it very hard to cite enough clean energy, even though that's become a major project for the Democratic Party? Why is so much that we do so goddamn slow? Medicare released its Medicare cards a year after it was passed into law. Getting prescription drug prices negotiated on 10 drugs took 3 years and will only go into effect this year, just in time for Donald Trump to take advantage of it and brag that it was him who did it. So this question of the sclerosis of liberal government, how do we actually make it deliver the things it is promising to deliver, is the core inquiry of the book.
So it needs to be said for everybody out there in the audience that both of these people are on the left. In fact, Ezra Klein actually opens this book by harking back to some kind of commie philosopher who talks about the utopia, and he states quite clearly that that is in fact his goal. However, what he ultimately ended up realizing is that a lot of institutional barriers put up by the left in order to stop things like oil companies, in order to stop excessive building, what they describe as excessive building, have essentially permeated and mutated to such a degree where we see in all these different various blue cities, it becomes impossible to build anything, and that includes the priorities of the progressive left. Now, he cites things like high-speed rail in California. Total disaster, total debacle. Somehow it's costing over $100 billion, and it's not even going to connect San Francisco to Los Angeles, which was the primary intent and goal of the project. Meanwhile, in Florida, you have the Bright Line, which was built for in and around $5 billion, all with private money. In addition to that, he talks about the problems in building affordable housing or any kind of housing in blue cities, in blue states versus in red cities or in red states. And this is basically the premise of his book. Now, you would think that Sam would agree with this, that there are all these pressures and lobbying groups that are preventing the building of housing. But in reality, Sam is way off the reservation, and he thinks the actual problem in terms of housing is capitalism, and what we need to do is socialize and decommodify housing, and that will somehow produce more housing, when that is just ridiculous and absurd, and again, not backed up by the fact that red states that have less regulations and are more capitalist end up having more building. But we'll get into that in just a little bit, because Sam's overall premise is that the primary main issue is in fact money.
But broadly, my critique is there seems to be an absence of, well, I think the culprits that you've chosen in some instances are correct, but broadly speaking, there's an absence of analysis of power dynamics. I think that and the interplay of money and politics, or I should say power in our society, I think is problematic. I mean, I think that, look, there have been questions about specific policies and assumptions. I've read critiques about your assessment of why China is able to do certain things and whatnot. But and I also think the power questions really filter through a lot of what you perceive to be problematic.
Now, the money in politics theory of everything is essentially your basic bitch alternative mindset to why things go down in American politics. And by the way, this is a narrative that's often put forward by Cenk Uygur of the Young Turks, and I've criticized it vociferously. And one of the reasons why I criticized it is because many a times in the real world, in the complicated world, what we actually see time and time again is that there are moneyed interests on both sides of virtually every single issue, and in reality, the money actually follows the politicians rather than paying them to change their mind, which ultimately just makes more sense. Would you give money to somebody, which would have to be more money to get them to change their mind on an issue, or would you give money to somebody that already aligns with you in order to support them to get them into office so they can act as an instrument on your behalf, because that's already the direction they're predisposed to go to? One is obviously more simple and more easy, but of course, the moneyed argument doesn't really make a lot of sense in terms of housing, and I'll explain why after we see them go back and forth on it for just a little bit.
Texas builds more housing than California. It builds more housing than New York. When people move to Austin and Houston and Dallas, they build homes. When people move to San Jose and San Francisco and Los Angeles, they don't. Is your view, do you find it a credible view to say that the issue is Texas has solved the corporate power problem, but California is permeable to corporate power and dominated by oligarchy in a way that Texas, or for that matter, Florida, is not?
Well, I don't know if it's necessarily, I think it's not necessarily corporate power. I think what we're talking about is money. I think we're just talking about money.
So
and
Texas has solved the money in politics problem, but California does not.
Well, I can tell you that, like, if you want to compare, let's say, San Francisco to Houston, right, you just have a lot more space in Houston. You have a lot more money in San Francisco. And so the power that rests with the money is more concentrated, literally, right? And has the ability in those instances to stop this housing project or that housing project.
So this is Ezra Klein trying to break through the argument about corporate greed or moneyed interests in Texas versus the state of California. And Sam attempts a counter right here where he's saying, oh, well, the money is more concentrated in the city of San Francisco versus in Houston and in Texas, where it's less money and it's more spread out. Now, of course, superficially, I could see why somebody would buy into this, but the fact is, the reality is that you have the same financial interest from developers in both areas, and in fact, you have greater financial interest to develop property in the city of San Francisco because the prices are so much higher, and yet you do not see the level of development that you see in Houston. And Ezra actually has a reasonable, rational explanation for this.
Like, look at Austin, for instance. You bring up Austin.
Mm-hmm.
In the course of Austin, and this was, I read this in the review, because obviously I'm not studying Austin or San Francisco for that matter. But Joe Wiesenthal wrote, that his observation about Austin was that it was cheap, and then it got very expensive. Then there was, and it was a function of costs went up, rents went up. It became expensive there.
Rents have gone down in Austin because they built so much.
They built so much.
I really want to hold on what you said the first time.
But
San Francisco has concentrated money in a way that
there was no change in the building codes, for instance.
So as you see, they're starting to talk about the moneyed interest, and then all of a sudden, Ezra Klein ends up pushing back. Sam Seder doesn't like that pushback, so he does what he often does in these debates, and he ends up pivoting to somewhere else. Now, of course, in this particular case, he ended up pivoting to Austin, which is really embarrassing for Sam, because had he actually paid attention to the book that he's talking about, he would know that he obviously is wrong about everything he's saying in the city of Austin. Now, of course, a bunch of people ended up moving to the city of Austin. Rents did go up, and by the way, it got worse during the pandemic because there were building supply shortages that negatively impacted rent. I have a lot of people in Austin that talk about the rent increases that they have. However, rents are actually falling in the city of Austin, which by the way, Sam Seder completely was unaware of, due to the fact that they actually revised their building code, allowed a bunch of upzoning, and by the way, this was the Democratic Party in Austin, so the average rent is dropping. Now, of course, some people are going to leave me comments saying, oh, rent up in Austin, my personal rent is up, but according to the data, rent is actually going down from its peak. So it went up due to population increase, it went up due to the building material shortage, building materials started to come down in price, they ended up doing upzoning, they ended up building a whole bunch more, and guess what? Supply and demand does work when it comes to housing, and rents have fallen in Austin. And for Sam Seder to say that they didn't do anything with the building code,
but San Francisco has concentrated money in a way that
there was no change in the building codes, for instance. Like the argument that
the building code responded in Austin. So you can just go look.
When Austin very famously changed their building code is insane and absurd in every possible way. But this goes to show you how little he knows about the subject matter that he's talking about, even when it's directly covered in the book.
Like the argument that
the building code responded in Austin. So you can just go look. You can, I mean, I don't know if you guys are able to pull up data on the show and show it, but just go pull it up if we can. You can search Fred housing starts in Austin and San Francisco.
Now, of course, Sam never pulls up this data because he'll never show information that contradicts him because he's a propagandist. But if you look up permits for cities in red states that don't have these zoning restrictions that are pro-building cities, one of the things that you'll see is that as price goes up, building permits go up. And as building permits go up, prices end up going down. And this is true not only for homes, but it's also true for rents. And by the way, in places where rent does not go down or home prices don't go down, what is actually happening is the rate of growth is slowing compared to in left-wing areas where you'll see like 10, 15, 20% jumps year over year, year after year. However, when you turn to California, and I'm a big fan of showing Los Angeles in this respect, what you ultimately end up seeing is that there appears to be no correlation at all whatsoever with with building permits and the price of property in California, which doesn't make any sense until you realize that California and the cities within California have bogged down through regulations their building process so much that they've completely severed the market signals from the appropriate market action, and therefore you're getting prices to go up. Again, this is basic stuff. If you restrict supply in the way that California does and demand goes up, prices will go up.
You could just do this in general. You can look at this analysis across blue and red cities.
But
what the difference? Hold, let me just. I want to go through this example, but we can go through a bunch of them. Houston doesn't have a zoning code. That's why it's easier to build there. I mean, I was talking to a developer there, and he said, "Look, the thing everybody knows about Houston, if you're a developer, is it's a bad place to be a homeowner. It's a good place to be a developer." And this is what I mean when I say the whole book, in a way, is about power. That in these procedural questions, in this question of how do you get housing approved, what we have created in many blue cities is a lot of veto points. And that veto point can be used by corporate power. It can be used by moneyed interests. It can be used by local homeowners who are not power in the way we would normally think of them, but sure as hell are power when you're thinking about whether or not to build housing. It can be used by all sorts of players. And so I think that one of the places where I quite diverge from some of my other friends on this is that I think when you create this level of proceduralism, this level of veto points, they get captured by interests over time. And that is a place where power can pool. Now, I think the place where I probably part, just to finish the thought, I think the place where I probably part is that I think that the left is often very attentive to power when it is coming from certain recognized villains, and much less attentive to power when it is coming from people who might in other contexts look like allies or just be local homeowners. But that can also be real power wielded in a problematic way.
Look, I don't agree with Ezra Klein on many things, but he is 100% correct right here. Houston is the largest city in this country with no zoning laws. The state of Texas overall actually caps upwardly how much zoning regulations you could put on in any city, so they can only go down versus the state law because they put a maximum cap on it. And that's why cities in Texas overall, and Houston specifically, consistently rate among the most affordable big cities. Even when prices go up, they don't go up to the extent that you see in a New York or San Francisco or Los Angeles, because again, the building is allowed to respond. It is builder friendly. The reason why homeowners can't get together and block all these different projects is because there aren't mechanisms for that in the law. Unlike California, which allows any group of a-holes to sue any developer for basically any reason, citing these environmental protection acts in order to stall every project. And by the way, as Ezra Klein points out, when it's government money involved, even if it's a small percentage, there's even more ways to litigate against development. So what you're seeing right here is not actually moneyed interests. In reality, it is the interests of the homeowners who definitely have money on the line. And by the way, people who are already residents that are renting, that are in rent stabilized or rent controlled apartments, because they already got theirs. They're voting to constrict the market because they're okay. And the people who want to move into these cities, the people who want to be residents in the future, have no vote at all whatsoever. The real dirty little secret about these policies is that they actually don't really have to do with money lobbying against money. In reality, you have people that are currently living there voting to make themselves more comfortable. If they're in a rent stabilized unit, you see this all the time. They vote against new developments and vote against any kind of increases while they're ending up distorting the market. And then you have the people who are trying to move there that get screwed over.
Well, but you listed off three entities that have power: corporate power, moneyed interests, and homeowners. And I would suggest to you that in all three of those that you just listed, that money is ultimately the controlling factor. So, for instance, I can tell you, like, I don't know San Francisco. I don't know Austin. I know Worcester, Mass. And I can tell you that during urban renewal, we had, there was an entire neighborhood that was completely, I don't know if you've ever been to Worcester, had gone through 290. There was an entire neighborhood called Laurel Clayton, I think it was, that ended up dumping people into a housing project, Plumley Village. And it was all run by the Worcester Redevelopment Authority. It was completely streamlined. None of the other, what we would call today groups There was no equity involved in this, or equitable justice or anything like this. And the neighborhood was completely destroyed because the input only essentially came from this big insurance company and the Worcester Redevelopment Authority, which was essentially owned by the same type of people. And I only know about this because a buddy of mine was homeless in high school because of how much destruction generationally it had created as a result of that. And so when you list off those three elements of power, in my mind, those are all moneyed interests.
So Sam ends up bringing up an apartment development, public housing that was built in the city of Worcester, and I don't honestly care about anything he said right here. It's a total deflection to an anecdote in a very specific city in the hopes that Ezra can't address that. But then he's like, oh, it's few and far between when the people that are fighting against the development don't have money, because he obviously does not understand the situation at hand. Again, if you're in a rent-controlled or rent-stabilized apartment and you're low income, you have the same incentives as homeowners in order to prevent new building from occurring. In fact, renters in New York City consistently vote against developers because idiots like Sam Seder have convinced them that they're the real villain in this process, so projects get stalled, they get bogged down with regulations, you have more so-called affordable units being mandated on these developers, and that drives down construction.
But we're talking here very specifically. The New York City is going to have to build housing that is affordable. We know, like, there are studies on this. You can read them. You can go talk to developers. Like, the reporting on this is like very straightforward. We know that when you trigger the public rules, it ends up being extremely, extremely expensive. We know that, like in San Francisco, where they would try to build a public toilet for almost $2 million, they do that here too. Why does it cost so much, and why does it so often fail when government tries to achieve the things we both want it to do?
I think property has been so commodified that there is such a profit incentive, such a money incentive to slow that roll, that it creates a whole litany. There's an everything.
We're talking about
there's an everything bagel.
We're talking about projects that are past that point.
Now, another thing that makes me laugh about Sam Seder's argument against Ezra Klein is that essentially he's saying that the only solution to this issue of housing in the United States of America is not to do what is done in the state of Texas, in cities like Houston, Dallas, and Austin, and let people build what is done in Nashville, Tennessee, what is done in a bunch of cities in Florida. The only solution is to decommodify housing, don't have housing as something that you could buy or sell, and declare housing a human right, which is so stupid, so unbelievably ridiculous, and honestly hilarious, because again, what we find out is all the positive outcomes of affordable housing are present in these deregulated environments.
Like, I think that, let me be really meta clear here on what I'm trying to do with you, because I think you keep wanting to pull it back to where we can, let's totally premise corporations are terrible, they are bad, they're like they are your enemy. Hold on.
They have their
cases,
agenda,
sure,
and we have ours.
Yes, there are cases where the government is building affordable housing on land they own or they have already bought, or they are funding somebody else to build it, that is already nonprofit housing. This is just like, it's not being done for profit. We are not in a commodified system. We know that housing costs more than the commodified housing costs to build. It is fine to say that it costs more. This is a totally reasonable interpretation. That is because wealthy landowners and wealthy corporations have colluded, maybe with other figures, on rules that have made it cost more. But which of these are you going to pull apart? Right? This is the trade-offs that we are trying to force people to confront in abundance.
So I told you guys earlier that Houston has no zoning, and that historically Houston has been one of the fastest growing cities in the United States of America. However, incomes grow at a level which still makes the average home in Houston affordable with the average income. This is very uncommon in American cities, and I know residents of Houston will talk about how prices are going up there and how it's harder, but again, it is not going out of whack anywhere near the level that you see in New York, California, and all these other highly regulated markets. But in addition to that, one of the things that people might not know about the city of Houston is that they actually have 6 times fewer homeless people compared to other metropolitan areas. Again, you could check these numbers for yourself. It appears that the average is in and around 300 per 100,000 homeless residents in any given metro area, but Houston is around 49 per 100,000, which is interesting because Houston is one of those warm weather cities, so they actually have natural disadvantages that allow homeless people to live on the streets. But the thing is, their no zoning, builder-friendly environment doesn't actually drive people onto the streets like Sam Seder and so many lefties argue. In fact, it appears, and it's asserted by Ezra Klein, that the opposite is true in the city of Houston. Again, the numbers speak for themselves, but Sam refuses to do that because we gotta decommodify housing because, oh my god, isn't it crazy that housing is something that you buy or sell, which by the way, works everywhere where you don't mess with it, but for some reason, we gotta cite the places that are run by these progressives that are more likely to believe what Sam believes and the disasters there as a reason to go more in that direction.
I don't think that you can say, I really want to push you here. I don't think you can say that the reason it costs more money and is so much more difficult and is so much slower to build nonprofit affordable housing than to build market rate housing is because we've over commodified housing. I just don't, or that Texas is better at building housing because they have somehow decommodified housing compared to California.
Well, they have more space. They simply have
plenty of space. If you go to San Jose, man, there is plenty of space. It's strip malls and single family homes.
Now, this is probably one of my favorite parts of this entire segment, where Ezra ends up suggesting that they have room to build in the Bay Area in places like San Jose. And by the way, this is 100% true. People often cite the square mileage of the city of San Francisco, but in reality, something like 2/3 of the land in the San Francisco area is not developed. And one of the reasons why it's not developed is not just regular ordinary zoning, which by the way, limits most of San Francisco to 3 stories maximum, and again, causes prices to go up dramatically, but it's also due to something called open space laws, which essentially, again, gives you the right as a random resident or special interest group or environmentalist group to sue developers because they're blocking your view of open space. Now, in Texas, they have an open space policy too. This might shock you, but the way that theirs works is completely different. You see, in Texas, if you want some open space, some property that is not developed, so you have a nice view of it, it's incumbent on you to buy the damn property yourself and keep it undeveloped. It's not incumbent on you to go to the city or go to the state, sue them, and have the government enforce against a property owner who just wants to develop. But again, Sam doesn't know anything about that. He doesn't understand this topic even 1%. And the most amazing thing that you're going to see right here from Sam Seder, who claims to have read Ezra Klein's book Abundance, claims to have internalized the arguments, and thus read a bunch of rebuttal essays so he can argue against it, is that he is going to prove Ezra Klein's core overall point to the extreme.
It is one of the richest tracts of land in the whole country, in the whole world. It could be skyscrapers. It could be Shenzhen. It is strip malls and single family homes. We have plenty of space in California.
I mean, I can't speak to San Jose.
Like Silicon Valley is what I'm talking about. Like you go ride around where the venture capital firms, man, I promise you will not leave that drive saying there is nowhere to build a 6-story apartment building.
And do we have public transport there? Like how are these homeless people?
We would if we could build it. That was part of what high-speed rail is supposed to be doing, which is why I'm so ripshit that it didn't happen.
And whose tax base is going to pay for that public transport and those buildings there? I mean, that's the point. It was our tax base. I was one of the taxpayers. I mean,
I am saying that I don't think it is plausible to say that the reason you can't build in like San Jose and you can in Texas is that we've decommodified in Texas. We just have it.
If you want to know why you can't afford a home or can't afford to rent a place in your city that's run by Democrats, aka people that Sam Seder would vote for if he was a resident in your city, it's exactly that logic right there. It's exactly that premise right there. And by the way, this is the primary argument from Ezra Klein's book Abundance, which is there's also an issue of mission creep with each and every one of these projects. So Sam Seder just asserted that if you have the open space to build property, to build housing for people, to increase supply, then you'll ultimately end up getting in a situation where that's too big of a problem for him because you don't have the tax money to build public transportation in order to get to and from that area. So you can't have housing because Sam Seder thinks that there should be public transit attached to that project. And again, if you want to do public transit, you can do public transit. That's on you. But the idea that we have to stall housing, stall increasing supply so people can actually afford to live because we don't have a subway system to this progressive idiot standards is exactly the problem. This is exactly how mission creep ends up overwhelming any kind of project, whether you support it or you don't. And again, this isn't the first time that Sam Seder ended up interjecting with one of these stupid ass points. He ended up criticizing Ezra Klein for supposedly being against air filtration systems for poor people in apartments. And again, let me play the clip for you right here.
There was one point in the book where you talked about we have a choice whether we're going to put filters into apartments that are built, public housing built near highways, or the people are going to live under the highway. And it seems to me that there's got to be a third choice, as opposed to we're going to poison people slowly or we're going to keep them unhoused.
Now, this is an example from the book Abundance, and it's actually an example from a program that was passed into law via ballot initiative called HHH, which is Housing, which essentially appropriates some percentage of the money, along with money raised through investors and nonprofits, to build affordable housing for homeless people. Californians voted for this, I believe, back in 2016 or something of the sort, and they built very little housing as a result of these programs. And one of the reasons why is, again, we have the issue of mission creep, because somewhere along the line, the state of California or the city of Los Angeles, I can't remember which, passed regulations that increased air filtration requirements for buildings that are close to highways in California, public housing buildings or buildings that receive government money. Now, it's very important for you guys out there in the audience to understand two very crucial facts about this regulation. Fact number one, there are already federal standards in terms of air filtration units that are required to be installed in public housing projects in areas that are close to a highway. In addition to that, California and Los Angeles already had additional higher standards on air filtration, again, for stuff that is built near a highway. This is another layer requiring an even more expensive, even more new air filtration system. And in the specific project that Ezra Klein was actually referencing, the delay caused investors to drop out, which again delayed the project by years, if not postponed it forever, and ended up killing the project. And Ezra Klein points out that this is completely ridiculous because a lot of these people would be perfectly fine with the standard normal air filtration system or the other increased air filtration system, just not to the level that this one had. And it is a better alternative than these people living under the highway underpass, which is where many homeless Californians live. And by the way, the air pollution from the highway worse under the underpass. I think we all understand that. Sam Seder is arguing against this. Sam Seder is saying, no, it's good that they stopped this project, which was public housing for the homeless, in order to get the super top of the line air filtration system, because the minimal damage that will be done from not having this exclusive 10 out of 10 top tier air filter that killed the whole project, by the way, is worse than these people living under the highway.
So I want to say specifically what you're talking about, that section. So I'm talking to Jasmine Tong, who's an affordable housing developer, does nonprofit affordable housing. And what she is saying is that compared to market rate housing, when she is building housing for homeless people, she is subject to environmental, green building standards, etc., that are so far beyond what market rate housing has to do that it often makes it impossible to finance the thing entirely. And a lot of these projects, as you both know, fall apart. And I am saying there that it makes a lot of sense. You understand how people get into a conversation that we should have better than average air filtration systems in, affordable housing built near a freeway, but in a city where you are not building enough affordable housing at all, because again, you have layered not just that, but a million of these onto every individual project. So again, it's costing much more per square foot than market rate housing. At some point, you have to
public
begin to choose.
housing is built near the highway. Why is that?
Say again?
Most public housing, some huge percentage of public housing is built near highways.
We're not even talking. Yes, that's all. I mean, listen, we're in agreement that that's all power. But when we are talking, I am saying that we are not building enough affordable housing.
I know, but I'm
in
saying,
California.
why are we addressing it that far downstream the issue when we're completely eliding the issue that is upstream from that,
We're
which
not
is
completely eliding the issue. The whole book, man, is about wrecking these zoning codes that allow rich people to keep it out of their areas.
Okay,
but if you can't build it in the first place because you can't make it affordable to build, which the people who build it will tell you, I think that I've actually found the set of arguments I've had in this really productive in a way. I don't disagree with you about power, but every time we talk about it specifically, you're like, yeah, that's a problem. But no, we actually have to solve the problem.
That is the practical reality of the stance that Sam Seder had, and that is exactly how it played out in terms of this project in California. But the difference is that Ezra Klein acknowledges that trade-off exists, but Sam Seder, like many progressives, doesn't believe in trade-offs. So even though he's like, oh, well, yeah, sure, that happened, and that's an example of that shutting down the project in your book, and all those homeless people that are under the underpass, they're actually much worse off. But in reality, we shouldn't have to consider that trade-off because that's not how the world should be. But Sam, that's how the world is, and your ideas, your attitude just killed the housing for those homeless people. Now, if you can believe this, Sam Seder repeatedly walking into trap after trap after trap, repeatedly proving the premise of Ezra Klein's book as he's trying to argue against it, isn't the dumbest thing that happened throughout the course of this interview. Sam Seder, if you guys don't know, and I've been on his show, and I'm just going to tell you, when you go on his show, you actually get a view of not only him, but his production staff has like 4 people that are all bringing information to him, printing out articles in order to make his arguments better. And you can actually see them again when you're in Ezra Klein's position because they don't know how to obscure them in terms of what you can see as a guest because they're not all that technically savvy. So, during the course of this conversation, Ezra Klein brings up a basic logical idea, which is increased supply when demand goes up and prices will level off. Supply and demand, basic economics. Well, guess what? Not only does Sam Seder not believe in trade-offs, he doesn't believe in supply and demand.
And I would suggest, I mean, look, there was this just came out, a report by the Fed, UCLA, that specifically addressed the question of whether it was housing constraints. California Federal Reserve researchers found that constrained housing supply is relatively unimportant in explaining the differences in rising house prices among U.S. cities.
Have you read the debate on this report?
I haven't.
But
it said higher income growth predicts the same growth. Okay, well, it's controversial. I mean, I'm willing to accept that. Like I say, I'm not a housing expert.
On some basic level,
to contrast,
right? If you have enough, things follow supply and demand. If you have enough of something, if you have too much of something, the price of it is going to fall. Right.
Imagine the audacity that you have to say, I'm going to interview somebody who wrote this entire book on this subject and he did all the research for it. I'm not even really going to understand any of the arguments that he's going to put forward. And at the same time, I'm going to have the commie dorks, the commie dopes that work for me print out little articles and send me notes that say basic things like supply and demand don't matter in terms of housing. And by the way, it's the reference of a specific study that is highly disputed, as is pointed out by Ezra Klein. And again, it is betrayed by the logic and the facts as presented in the data. Again, we can see housing prices go down in Nashville, stabilize in the DFW area, go down in Austin, go down in many cities in Florida. And even though they're not down from their pre-pandemic levels, before a bunch of people moved over there, when there was the building supply shock and all of that, they are down from their peak, and that is all due to the fact that these areas let you build, but Sam still denies it. This guy genuinely believes that the actual problem, the real culprits behind this, are people who buy land and sit on it, despite the fact that prices are high all around them, because it's not economically advantageous enough for them to put it on the market or to develop it. Again, as he's advocating for restricting developers. And by the way, it is possible that this to a certain extent is a thing that is going on. But the reason people would do this when prices are high, because the market would indicate that they would do something else, is due to regulatory burdens. Again, rent control, rent stabilization. By the way, we saw this in Buenos Aires, where Javier Milei ended up getting rid of these programs. And what ended up happening was that prices dropped by about half. And the reason for that is because the available units on the market tripled, because they were being held off the market due to the fact that laws were keeping them below market levels. So that is a possibility that that could be happening, but Sam Seder's not in favor of getting rid of rent control or rent stabilization. Another reason why is, again, restrictions on developments. The fact that in these blue cities, any random a-hole can sue you for trying to redevelop your property leads to all these different various problems that don't make it cost effective, even despite the high prices, for you to develop those properties. So yeah, Sam is just wrong about everything, and the fact that he really genuinely just proved Ezra's point time and time again is embarrassing. But of course, I want to know what you guys think down in the comments below. Have you read Ezra Klein's book Abundance? Are you interested in it? And as per usual, if you like this video, you can show them by leaving a like, subscribe for more content, follow me on the social medias, support me, support links in the description of this video. This has been me talking about Sam Seder failing miserably. Till next time.